My second year teaching, I almost destroyed a kid's confidence. It was the third week of school, and the 3-page paper that he turned in was one long sentence. No commas, no periods, no words capitalized. And I tried to think of how to start my conversation with him. And I asked, Tony, when you turn this in, how'd you feel about it? And he said, well, Mr. Scheur, I guess I felt kind of proud. And I said, tell me more. And he said, well, I never turned a paper in before. And if an 11th grader can slip through the cracks because our classrooms are that crowded, then clearly we're not doing enough. 73% of our students are below grade level in writing. And for the last 8 years on the SAT and the ACT, the lowest scores are not in math, they're not in reading, they're on the writing section. So let's analyze how we got here. Like, why do we have this problem in the first place? This is how students learn to write. Most kids work on their papers independently. Then they turn them into a teacher who grades them in a dark room, probably around 3 in the morning. Then that happens. Then students get their papers back. They feel guilty for a few minutes. They look at the red marks. And then they usually throw the papers out, or they lose them. And then before they've even gotten the paper back, they're asked to write another one. And they have to continue through this loop without actually being able to incorporate feedback into future drafts. Also, somewhere in the building is an administrator who's worried about the fact that test scores aren't improving. And another way that we could conceptualize this is a conveyor belt, where students are passed from grade to grade and never actually have the resources or the time to improve. Time is really the operative word. If you think about the fact that most high school teachers have 170 students in their classes, if every teacher spent 15 minutes, just 15 minutes, grading each paper, that would be 42 hours of grading after school every time they gave an assignment. So that means that students aren't getting a lot of feedback, and then the feedback that you are getting is going to be kind of rushed. And a really good example of that is this very common piece of feedback that students get in their papers: blend your quotes. And all that means is that students need to learn to integrate evidence so that their paragraphs work well with the quotes that they're using. But there's a lot to know in order to get this right. In order to blend one's quotes, you need to know how to cite the specific time when the quote occurs, who the speaker is, who the listener is. You have to be able to trim down the quote necessarily. You have to be able to cite it correctly. You also have to be able to make sure that you can modify the quote for clarity. And then, of course, you have to know the punctuation that goes before the quote and after the quote, and you have to have enough context clues to explain to people why the quote is necessary. Then you have to elaborate on the quote afterwards, and you have to analyze why your quote helps explain the point of your paragraph to begin with. It's a lot to know. And that's all you see. So in math, tens of millions of dollars have been spent building technology products to help with education outcomes. But there's very little happening in literacy right now, and almost nothing happening in writing. So let's think for a second about if technology could revolutionize the way that we learn to write, what would such a curriculum look like? Well, first of all, it would promote creativity, because the reason we write is that we want to share ideas. It would help us break down difficult concepts, and it would give us unlimited practice and immediate feedback so that we could get better quickly. Then it would be able to adapt to our strengths and weaknesses, and it would also encourage us to collaborate with others and make sure that when we finally got an assessment of our writing, that it was accurate and it was authentic. So, instead, this is what we have. $1.7 billion every year are spent on standardized tests, on Scantrons. And this is really bad for how we learn to write. And here's a specific example. When you look at a multiple choice question, the goal is for you to identify the error more than it is for you to find the solution. And in this specific question, the word there may be the problem, but it's really an agreement issue between the word each, which is singular, and there, which is plural. So if you were actually asked to fix the problem, you would end up making a lot of edits to the sentence that had nothing to do with what the error was. Another example, something that multiple choice kind of forces you to do, is choose between not wrong answers and definitely wrong answers. So in this case, we have a long passage underlined, And what you're supposed to do is compare all these possibilities and try to find the answer that's least wrong. It's a very anxiety-producing experience. But given the way that Google search works, given the way that we're able to use data now to power the engines that make the internet work, why can't we just give a student a text box and let him type in his own response, and then use previous responses to evaluate whether that makes sense or not? Then we could actually get rid of all this distracting non-answer stuff, and we could have a much more authentic assessment. So, to borrow a line from John Updike, the way that any activity becomes creative is when the doer cares about doing it right or doing it better. And writing really should be a collaborative process, right? And the reason that we write is to share ideas. And so it only makes sense that students would be able to evaluate each other's work. Many years ago, a student, Jamal, was going to write a paper about how Romeo and Juliet died at the end of the play. And I asked him, well, if you're going to write that, have you found anyone who disagrees that that actually happened? Because if everyone agrees, why write the paper? And so he went around and he surveyed every student in the class. And he came back to me and he said, well, here's what I found out. Everybody agreed that they died, except for Elizabeth. I asked why, what happened to her. Well, I don't think she read the play. So instead, for his paper idea, the question was, well, why did they die, right? And what I advised him to do is actually think specifically about how much blame each character had for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. Can you divide up this exact amount of guilt? And then once you've made such a pie chart of guilt, go around again and survey people and find out where they specifically disagree with you. That's a paper idea, because it's original, it's controversial, and it's something that you understand. And if you think about good writing, there's lots of reasons that we should be leveraging the people in the classrooms to help us. First of all, good writing is clear, and that just means that your peers can understand it. Second of all, it's credible, which means your peers believe you after they read it. And it just has to be interesting, which means that they get all the way through, or at least halfway. So teachers are very good at giving interesting prompts that get students excited about describing things in a vivid way. But what's very overwhelming for the teacher, and much harder to do, once a student crafts a response, is to parse it out, to look at specific parts of the paper that are effective and not effective before a grade. But with technology, we could simply allow students to vote. Imagine +1ing specific parts of a paper that are good. And also being able to bring out for a student the particular parts of a paper that aren't effective. An activity I used to do with my students to help them cut fluff was to paste wordy phrases all around the classroom. And students would go around in groups with markers, and they would eliminate as many words as they could. And the students who had eliminated the most words would get the most points. And so that was a pretty good activity, except the problem was that I didn't know who in the group actually understood how to cut fluff and who didn't, who was just trailing along. So when Google Forms came out, I posted this online, and I told students, well, each of you is actually going to cut each quote down. And I want you to do the best you can, and then we'll look at the data, and we'll see the variety of responses that we get. And what an activity like this reveals, if we just look at one sentence, the duty of a clerk is to check and record incoming mail, is that people come up with some really interesting responses that you wouldn't anticipate. So a bunch of people wrote, a clerk checks and records incoming mail. Others, clerks check all mail and record it. A clerk checks and records the mail. And then clerks check and record mail. Lots of ways of saying the same thing. But the point is that there are many right answers, right? There's not one right answer and a whole bunch of wrong answers. That's just not how writing works. And so that's not the way that we should be trained. So where I probably had the biggest problem without technology was how to help students with grammar. In fact, I was so concerned about it that I documented every single misconception that students had on their papers, and I would give them numbers and letters. And then I put together an 80-page manual that they could refer to after they graded, after they looked at what I wrote. So, thank you. But here's the thing. That's not enough, as it turns out. So 8.1 can refer to a comma splice, and 13.4c can refer to, well, you had a quote and you had something before it, but there was no colon in the middle. And even after that, students could have the opportunity to go back and make specific revisions to everything I pointed out. But when you think about the math, if there's 170 students and everyone does 50 revisions to his paper, that's 8,500 corrections that I'm looking at in a dark room at 3 in the morning. And that made me sad. And so I tried to create activities to make this possible. I actually laminated a bunch of phrases and parts of speech, and I had students kind of turn the classroom into a shrine of grammar and language. Except that once I spent $1,000 of the school's laminating budget, I realized that I probably couldn't sustain this activity for very long. Technology at scale can be a lot cheaper. So I hired an engineer to help me build something that could actually take students' interests, their favorite celebrities, their personal interests, their friends, and to generate questions that were about them. So a Justin Bieber fan would see Justin Bieber hollered my name running toward me with the oversized stuffed animal that he just won. And students can drag in punctuation, as you see. They can click to capitalize or uncapitalize. They can throw out what they don't need. This is an authentic assessment of what students know and what they don't, because they have freedom. And then let's say a student makes a mistake in the sentence about Barack Obama doing a handstand. Maybe the student chooses to capitalize handstand. It's an interesting choice. Rather than just marking him wrong, we can actually focus on the specific problem that he has. And then if he still gets it wrong, we can show him a hint. And if he gets it wrong again, then we can actually show him his specific mistake, give him a model of how to build the sentence, and then generate another question with a different example but the same programmatic substructure so that he can practice it until he gets it right. This is what we need technology to do. And we can apply the same concept for helping kids with hyphens, helping people tell the difference between whos and whos. You can even use it to help people understand when to capitalize the word ant, when it's a common noun and when it's a proper noun. And as students are doing all this, we can be crunching the data, giving students summaries of how they're doing, and then showing them color-coded heat maps to let them know where they need more practice. So in this case, conjunctive adverbs is where I made a mistake, and I need to do more work on that particular topic. Now that would be good in and of itself, but teachers can actually see how everyone in the class is doing simultaneously and quickly use that to inform instructional practice. So I can see in my class a lot of blue for general contractions, can't, isn't, shouldn't. But all that red over there, that's plural nouns. That's the Sanchez's keep beating me in Scrabble, and the Joneses haven't given me my tape measure back. And once we know the specific problem, the specific area, I can drill down further and look at how many attempts it's taking each student to answer questions correctly and to achieve mastery. And I can even drill down and look at their specific responses. So what kind of impact can a technology product have? Well, in my 8th year, I spent a few months building this, and then I shared it with 50 teachers at a local event. And 4 weeks later, I logged on, and there were 1,500 people using it. In 9 weeks, there were 15,000. And it's been 20 months since that mark, and now students have solved over 40 million questions. So here's the thing. I believe that technology can play a very powerful role in improving education outcomes, and specifically improving writing. But it's imperative that educators and teachers play a fundamental role in creating the products that we need. Because while everybody talks about how it's important to improve education, there's nobody who's more invested in what goes in your papers than the people writing them and the people who have to grade them. Thank you.